Today I'm going to be talking about my deep, very deep love for Lord of the Rings and J.R.R. Tolkien in general. I recently reread The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings for only the second time in my life, and so I have a lot of thoughts and I just enjoy this reread so much. So I really wanted to make a video dedicated to some of the things that I learned and some of the things that I noticed rereading it as a little bit of an older person. I last read them in college, I think 2011, so I would have been like 21 years old. So now, being the ripe old age of 30 years old, I wanted to talk about these books and do a sort of review and also an author overview. I also buddy read these with Naomi from Naomi's Bookshelf, and she's done some individual book reviews as well, and so I'll link some of those down below, and you should definitely check out her channel too. Naomi was experiencing these books actually for the first time, so it was really fun to get to read them with her and kind of see her reactions to the events, as I think she'd seen the movies but she hadn't read the books before. So I really enjoyed seeing her as a first-time reader read through these and seeing her thoughts and reactions. So today we're going to take a look at J.R.R. Tolkien himself and also at some overarching themes throughout his works. And just so you know, there will be spoilers in this video for Lord of the Rings. So if you've somehow avoided watching or reading them throughout your life or hearing about them at all, please stop this video and go take care of that. Go watch them, go read them, and then come back. I'll wait. Actually, just kidding, I can't wait that long. So let's talk about the man himself, J.R.R. Tolkien. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien lived from 1892 to 1973. He was born in South Africa because his father, Arthur, was an English bank manager who had been relocated there for work. However, his father, Arthur, dies from rheumatic fever when J.R.R. is only a toddler, and his mother Mabel relocates J.R.R. and his younger brother Hilary back to England, where they can be more supported by other relatives. The English countryside and provinces where he hung out as a kid would later be the inspiration for the Shire. And fun fact, they actually referred to one of their aunt's farms as Bag End. J.R.R. was a very smart student. He was a smart kid. His mother instilled a love of botany in him at a young age and also a love for languages. It's said that he had an especial knack for learning and speaking foreign languages, which definitely would explain why he would be interested in literally creating new languages, such as Elvish in his fantasy books. I mean, seriously, how smart do you have to be to create your own languages? Sadly, his mother Mabel dies when he's only 12 years old. She had diabetes, and unfortunately, insulin would not be discovered for another 20 years. So at a very young age, Tolkien has lost both parents, and he knows what it is to grieve. Themes of grief and loss are very evident in Lord of the Rings. Before she dies, Mabel gives guardianship of her sons to a close friend of hers who is Catholic, and this is important because Mabel was ostracized from her Baptist family for her choice to become a Catholic. So Catholic values will be very much instilled in Tolkien as he grows up. So anywho, he grows up, invents a few different languages with some of his cousins. You know, they didn't have video games back then, so I guess inventing new languages was something you could do to pass the time. And he receives all kinds of accolades and honors at school, and he decides to attend Exeter College in Oxford and studies English literature. He meets Edith Mary Bratt at the age of 16, and they get married some years later. And Tolkien writes to a friend that he is very surprised at his wife's willingness to marry a man with no job, little money, and no prospects, except the likelihood of being killed in World War I. Another fun fact, Edith is actually the inspiration for the character Luthien in the Silmarillion. I probably said that wrong, but you know what book I'm talking about, I think. In the summer of 1914, England enters into World War I. Tolkien is highly criticized by his family for not initially volunteering to fight, although he does eventually cave and just finds a way to delay his enlistment until he finishes his college degree. In the war, he finds himself in leadership positions, but he has written about how much he hated the experience and his general disdain for having to boss people around. In 1916, he was discharged due to developing trench fever, which he probably contracted from some really nasty bites from a lice outbreak. Shortly after Tolkien was sent back to England, His battalion was heavily attacked, and ultimately all of his closest friends, save for one, were killed in the war. Tolkien felt the oppressive shadow of war weighing very heavily on him as he contemplated the fact that he would have likely been killed as well had he not been discharged. By the summer of 1919, Tolkien was officially demobilized from the military and started working at Oxford English Dictionary. And 5 years later, he would go on to become a professor at Pembroke College. It was during this time that Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and the first 2 volumes of Lord of the Rings. Something else I found really interesting, and might even contribute to a deeper understanding of the Lord of the Rings, is how heavily Tolkien was influenced by Beowulf. During his time at Pembroke College, he took on translating Beowulf and also gave some very important lectures on the work, which would have a huge effect on the scholarly work surrounding Beowulf. Tolkien argued that the monsters and fantasy elements in Beowulf were absolutely essential to the story, and that Beowulf was more about human destiny than tribal warfare and politics. Many critics of the time saw fantasy elements as childish or extraneous, and so I think you could definitely make the argument that Tolkien was one of the first real advocates for counting fantasy as a serious genre that has the capacity to explore deep adult themes, rather than just a genre that you only explore when you need a fairy tale to tell your children at bedtime. Speaking of the fantasy genre, it's time to point out some of my very favorite themes in Lord of the Rings. For this first theme, I'm just gonna call it the inevitability of fallen kingdoms, for lack of a more concise way to put it. And fallen kingdoms is always due to the corruption of mankind, or dwarf kind for that matter. Throughout the series, we see several decrepit and fallen kingdoms, and some of them are of bygone eras and some of them are currently falling. An early example of this is when the Fellowship are traveling through Moria, and Gimli's really excited about it because he is very excited to show his companions that there was this glorious dwarf kingdom, and he's really excited to show them all of the glittering majesty that he's been told about and has been told in legends passed down to him. However, when they arrive, Gimli's pretty disappointed to find out that it's not what he thought it was, and it's actually overrun by orcs, it's falling down and decaying, and it's also become the home of some not so nice critters such as Balrogs. Gimli's expectations clearly don't match reality here, and he's very disappointed. We also have some long, and I do mean long, conversations with elves, where they have seen a lot of things and they are immortal. And so they tell us about a kingdom called Numenor, which was a fallen kingdom of mankind. We also learn about Gondolin from the elves, which was a hidden elfish city. Elvish, probably elvish is the right word. And that city actually falls not because of corruption from the outside, but actually from a betrayal from the inside, and that city gets taken over by the Dark Lord. I think you get the point, but definitely a strong theme in Lord of the Rings is the inevitability of corruption and kingdoms falling, either from evil forces from outside of the universe or inside, until the true king comes to restore peace to the land. And here's where we get into some of our Christian themes. I'm going to talk a little bit about Christianity and the Christ figures that are sprinkled throughout the book. There are 3, maybe 4, you could argue for a 4th, Christ figures in the book. The 3 obvious ones are Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragorn, and then maybe Sam is a 4th one, and so I'll get into that in a little bit. But let's talk about Frodo and the correlations that we see with him. Frodo is very obviously portrayed as the sin bearer. Frodo is literally carrying this dark, evil artifact that represents evil and power and the sin of the world. He is carrying it up to Mount Doom. And Frodo also knows that he's going to be a sacrifice throughout his journey. It's alluded to all the time that Frodo knows he might not come back. He knows this might be his last journey ever. However, this analogy only goes so far, because when Frodo gets to Mount Doom and he's about to throw the ring of power into the fires, he exclaims, "I will not do this deed." And it's clear that the ring itself has just overtaken him, and he's not sacrificial. He's not going to be strong enough to do this thing. But luckily we have Gollum there to finish the job, because Gollum is a character who has gone so far over to evil that there is really no true redemption possible for Gollum, which makes him a very sad and tragic character. Now let's talk about Gandalf. Gandalf is more of a prophet type of character. He just can do all this mysterious stuff that no one else can really do and is never very explained to us. We just know he is a wizard and he has power. But what's interesting about Gandalf is how often he foreshadows, and his dialogue is used very often to foreshadow the next events that are coming. He drops a lot of hints to our characters and to our readers about what's about to happen. He also has some sacrificial moments and sacrificial battles himself, and he literally sacrifices himself, dies, and is reborn. Gandalf returns after his battle with the Balrog as Gandalf the White. And so if that's not a Christ metaphor, I don't know what is. Aragorn is very clearly the Messiah character. Aragorn has no kingdom. He is a wanderer in the wilderness of sorts, and he has come to restore peace back to the kingdom. It's literally his destiny to become king, and so many of the other characters around him know this and are just waiting for that moment. He's just kind of biding his time until all the conditions are in place for him to take the throne. His becoming king is going to bring the peace that Middle-earth desperately needs ever since Sauron created the Rings of Power. And in case it wasn't super obvious to you, Sauron definitely represents Satan. Yep, definitely Satan. Sauron is so interesting to me because his powers literally permeate all of the land, and he has his minions doing his will in every corner of the world. However, we never really get a clear physical description of Sauron. He's more of this presence and this watching eye. He can turn his gaze to different corners of the land, and yet he can't be everywhere at once. Isn't that interesting? So he's not a god. He's not omnipresent or omniscient in any way. And we know this because while Sauron is distracted by all of the complicated politics and fighting going on in Rohan and Gondor, and everybody's battling, he literally doesn't know that Frodo is at his gates and at his fiery pits. He literally does not know. Isn't that interesting? So yeah, Sauron is a very obvious metaphor for Satan, but I probably didn't need to tell you that. And then there's Sam Gamgee. Sam is my personal favorite character in Lord of the Rings because he is the character who is most willing to lay down his life for his friends. Interestingly, in the end, Sam is the one who gets to settle down in the Shire with a nice life, and he gets married and has kids, and he basically inherits Bag End, and he is sort of the ruler of the Shire of sorts. Not that there's really a ruler, but he becomes kind of the protector of the Shire. So some scholars have pointed to Sam as representing the Bible verse, "The meek will inherit the earth," and Sam maybe represents that. This is really fascinating stuff to me, but I'm gonna have to go on to the next theme because you could really explore a lot more religious themes in these books, but we don't want to be here all day. So speaking of Sam, let's talk about the next theme, one of my favorite themes, and that's friendships. Friendships are obviously a key part of these works. We even see that in The Hobbit. For Bilbo, without his friendships with the dwarves, he would have never gotten as far as he did. He just wouldn't have. None of the characters in The Lord of the Rings can work alone, except maybe you could argue Gandalf, but even he has a network of friends who are helping him and doing things for him. Frodo and Sam are the very obvious friendship center of this book. But I actually want to talk about Gimli and Legolas because I think Frodo and Sam's friendship is very one-sided. It's definitely Sam who's doing all the legwork in that friendship. Not that Frodo doesn't care about Sam, he does. But for this discussion, I want to focus on Gimli and Legolas for a minute. Gimli and Legolas are interesting because they're very unlikely friends. Their races have a history of baggage, and inherently they don't like each other. They're not supposed to like each other. However, throughout the book, we see that their friendship actually sharpens each other's skills and they grow as people. They even make a pact to visit each other's lands and kind of see where the other person came from. Gimli develops a huge respect for elves, and he kind of falls in love with Galadriel and worships her. And similarly, Legolas really learns to appreciate Gimli and all of his strengths that he brings to the table. They have lots of friendly competition with each other, which makes us smile, and they also ultimately fight side by side on the same side of the war, and they have each other's backs. I would imagine that Tolkien also experienced some of this comradeship when he was in the war, because Tolkien was not really your typical manly man, not really the typical guy who goes to war. He was an intellectual, and so I can imagine him making friends with his fellow soldiers who are nothing like him and who are more manly and brutish than him. I personally kind of picture Tolkien as a Legolas character, and then Gimli as representing maybe the soldiers that he might have met in the war, but I'm just spinning ideas at this point. So let's get down to our final theme that I want to discuss in this video, and that is grief and loss. Throughout the book, we are given, let's just say, a lot of songs. Some people get annoyed at all the songs in The Lord of the Rings, and I've even seen some people say that they skip the songs when they read the book. No, bad. Don't skip the songs. The songs are good. They're important. They tell you things. They're also dang good poetry, so don't skip them. They're nice. If you read them carefully, you almost always get a flavor for lost bygone days, or goodbyes, or losing a loved one. And part of this is that the songs are also used to tell us mythology stories throughout the book. And so a lot of the mythology and history of the Middle Earth, of course, does end tragically, because that's what happens with people. I already touched on this a little bit, but the Misty Mountains scene when the Fellowship are traveling through and they lose Gandalf, after that point, there's a striking amount of talk about what the characters are experiencing emotionally. But the saddest thing about that is that they can't stop and mourn. They have to continue. They have to put one foot in front of the other and keep going. I imagine that this is also similar to what Tolkien might have experienced in his own war experiences, because you lose friends, but you have to get up in the morning the next day and complete your duties and fight another day. Something else that stood out to me a lot more upon this reread is Frodo's return to the Shire. While Sam adapts pretty quickly back to the rhythms of life in the Shire and he establishes a family for himself, Frodo doesn't have this experience. Frodo is fundamentally changed by his experiences. I think Frodo is the character that most clearly represents post-traumatic stress disorder. Sam frequently finds him sitting and staring into space, or he sees Frodo just kind of go mentally to another place, and Frodo is not really the same happy hobbit that he was. Frodo even makes a remark that he thought he could be happy again going back to the Shire, but he's just not the same hobbit anymore. He is so badly shaken by what's happened to him, and the memories are just so strong that he's different. He's just changed. Anybody who's read the books or even just watched the movies knows that the goodbyes in this book are very long drawn out. We spend a lot of time saying goodbye. We spend a lot of time recapping things and hugging and kissing farewell. I think that Tolkien does this because he wants to convey to his readers a sense of heaviness and seriousness, and he wants us to make sure we know that the characters are going through emotions that are very real. He knows that goodbyes are hard and that you don't just close the book on someone and then move on with your life. That person stays with you. When you become separated from a friend, it's painful, especially if you've gone through a lot together. We're gonna have to stop talking about this because I'm gonna legit start crying in a second. Anyways, there is so much that you can talk about regarding themes and Tolkien and his life, and there's so much you can talk about. So I have to stop here because there's many more that I could go into, but we're just gonna stop here. However, if this video did anything for you, I hope it maybe starts you on a path of researching these works more and their influence in the world and in literature, because these books just mean so much to me, and I know a lot of you guys feel the same way. I'd love to chat with you in the comments more. Let me know if you have a favorite theme in Lord of the Rings that I neglected to bring up. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Feel free to subscribe to my channel if you want to keep up with my bookish content. Keep reading great books, and until next time, I think it's time for a second breakfast.